This is my true story. I gave everything I had to raise my son. I worked through hunger, sickness, and storms just so he could live a better life. I thought when I grew old, he would remember those nights I skipped meals so he could eat. But I was wrong. One day, when I was weak and hungry, I asked him for a little food, and he laughed in my face and made me beg for it. That moment shattered me completely. But I didn't stay broken. You won't believe what happened next. Before I tell you, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And please subscribe so my story can reach more people. I still remember that day like it happened yesterday. I was sitting at the kitchen table, my hands trembling, my stomach empty. I hadn't eaten since morning, but I didn't want to bother anyone. I waited until dinner was over, until everyone else had finished. Then I asked quietly if I could have just a small bowl of rice, maybe a little more soup. My son looked at me from across the table, a smirk on his face. He leaned back in his chair and said, "You've eaten enough, Dad. Don't beg." The room went silent for a second. Then he laughed. His wife laughed too. Even the sound of their laughter felt heavier than hunger itself. I tried to smile, to pretend it didn't hurt. I told myself maybe he was joking, maybe he didn't mean it that way. But the truth was clear. I was no longer his father in that moment, just an old man sitting in his house, unwanted and pitied. I looked down at the empty bowl in front of me, my hands shaking, my throat too tight to speak. That laughter stayed in my ears long after they left the room. When you raise a child, you don't think about payback. You don't expect gratitude. You just give your time, your strength, your love. You think your sacrifices mean something. But that day I learned how quickly love can turn to mockery when pride takes over. He didn't see the father who carried him on his shoulders when he was little. He didn't see the man who worked double shifts just to buy his school uniform. He only saw an old man, tired and weak, who no longer had anything to offer. After they went to their room, I sat there for a long time, staring at the cold rice stuck to the side of the pot. I didn't touch it. I didn't eat. The hunger in my stomach was nothing compared to the hunger in my heart. The hunger to still be respected, to still be seen as someone who mattered. It was the kind of pain that didn't make noise, the kind that just sits inside you and burns slowly. That night, I slept on the couch. I could hear them laughing from their room, probably talking about me again. I tried not to listen, but the walls have a way of carrying words you wish you couldn't hear. "He's so dramatic," I heard her say. "Maybe he should go live in a home." And my son didn't stop her. He didn't defend me. He just laughed. I turned toward the wall, covering my face with the blanket, and cried quietly. Not because of hunger, but because I realized something I had never wanted to admit. I had become a burden in my own child's eyes. The same child I had once called my reason to live now looked at me like I was something to be ashamed of. I wanted to leave right then, but I had nowhere to go. So I stayed. Not out of choice, but because my body had grown too weak to start over. Every morning I woke up before them, made tea, cleaned the kitchen, pretended not to notice when they ignored me. I thought maybe, someday, he would soften again, remember who I was, what I did for him. But that day never came. That small bowl of rice became a wall between us. It wasn't about food anymore. It was about dignity. And when a father has to beg his own son for food, something inside him dies. I didn't know it then, but that humiliation would become the start of everything that followed. The same shame that broke me that night would one day become the reason people all over the country would know my name. That night, after they went to sleep, I sat alone in the dark kitchen. The moonlight came through the window and hit the table where I had begged for food hours before. My body was weak, but my mind was awake. I kept replaying his words. "Don't beg." Over and over, like a wound that wouldn't close. I tried to understand how my own son, the boy I once carried through storms, could look me in the eye and say that to me. I had fed him with my hands when he was a baby. I had given up meals so he could eat. And now, when I was hungry, all I got was laughter. The pain wasn't just inside me. It lived in every breath I took after that day. I could feel it when I tried to sleep. I could feel it when I looked at my hands, rough and scarred from decades of work. These were the same hands that built his childhood, that fixed his shoes, that built the table we used to eat at together. But now, those same hands were shaking from weakness, unwanted, unseen. For years, I had stayed silent when he insulted me. It started small, a joke about how slow I walked, how I repeated stories, how I didn't understand his new world. Each time I laughed along, pretending it didn't sting. I thought it was normal, that young people today were just different. But slowly, the jokes turned into open disrespect. He stopped listening to me altogether. My advice was old-fashioned. My presence was in the way, and I told myself it was okay, because he was my son, because I loved him. But that night, something changed. The laughter didn't sound like teasing anymore. It sounded cruel, cold, final. It felt like the sound of a door closing forever. I didn't cry loud, I didn't scream. I just sat there, empty. You reach a point in life where pain becomes quiet, where it stops shouting and starts whispering. You've been forgotten. That's what I felt that night. Forgotten. I thought about the years I spent working 2 jobs just to buy him a bicycle. I thought about how he used to run to me after school shouting, "Dad," with that big smile on his face. I thought about how proud I was the day he graduated, even though I had to sell my watch to buy his graduation suit. I thought about how I used to imagine that when I got old, he'd take care of me the same way I took care of him. But dreams don't always survive reality. The next morning, I couldn't look at him. He sat at the table with his wife, talking about work, about money, about how expensive everything was. I was invisible again. I didn't eat. I didn't speak. I felt like a stranger in my own home. Every sound felt sharp, the clinking of dishes, the creak of the chair, even his voice. It all hurt, not because of the noise, but because of what it meant. It meant I didn't belong anymore. That was when I realized the worst part of growing old isn't the sickness or the weakness. It's the loneliness that comes when the people you love start looking through you instead of at you. It's when you're still alive, but treated like you're already gone. That pain stayed with me, heavy like a rock in my chest. It followed me through every day that came after. I tried to forget, but I couldn't. No matter what I did, his words echoed. Don't beg. It became a scar that refused to fade. I didn't know what life had planned for me after that. I didn't know that the same pain that broke me would one day make me known. I didn't know that humiliation could turn into power. But in that moment, I made one silent promise. I would never beg again, not for food, not for love, not for respect. And someday, he would see the man he threw aside rise higher than he ever imagined. After that night, I changed. Something inside me cracked, but it didn't break the way I thought it would. It was quiet at first. No shouting, no anger, no tears. Just a heavy kind of silence that filled every corner of my chest. I stopped speaking much around the house. I ate little, worked less, stayed out of the way. I didn't want to bother anyone. I had become what they already saw me as. Invisible. But silence has power. It starts to grow roots inside you. It makes you think, not with emotion, but with clarity. Every night, I sat on my bed and stared at the ceiling. I thought about every moment that led me there. Every sacrifice, every meal skipped, every broken promise I made to myself while trying to build a better life for my son. I used to think pain was something that would pass with time, but I was wrong. Some pain becomes a teacher. It sits beside you, reminding you of every mistake you made trusting the wrong people, loving the wrong way. One evening, while they were out with friends, I walked into the kitchen. The lights were off. I opened the fridge. There was plenty of food, meat, rice, fruit, leftovers. I stood there, just staring at it. My stomach ached with hunger, but I didn't touch anything. I didn't want it anymore. It wasn't the food I wanted. It was the respect that should have come with it. The thought hit me hard. Maybe I'd spent my whole life feeding people who never learned gratitude. Maybe I was the fool who thought love would always be enough. I sat at the table, the same place where he had laughed at me, and I felt something shift inside. For years, I had accepted humiliation because I thought that's what a father was supposed to do. Endure everything, forgive everything. But that night, I realized endurance and weakness aren't the same thing. I could forgive him, but I didn't have to stay small. I didn't have to die feeling like nothing. I whispered to myself, if this is what he sees when he looks at me, I'll show him what he's missing. It wasn't anger anymore, it was resolve, cold, steady, powerful. I didn't know what I was going to do or how, but I knew one thing for certain. I would not leave this world remembered as the man who begged his son for food. The next morning, when I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw a different man. My face was older, lined with pain, but my eyes, they were sharper. There was life in them again. That was the day I took the old notebook from the drawer. It was empty except for a few random numbers and addresses. I stared at the first blank page, and without really planning to, I began to write. At first, the words came slowly. I wrote about that night, about the hunger, about the laughter, about the way my son's eyes looked when he said those words. Then I wrote about the years before that, the struggles, the sacrifices, the dreams I buried to give him comfort. Page after page, I poured everything out. I didn't know why I was doing it. I just knew it made the weight a little lighter each time I pressed the pen down. By midnight, I had filled 10 pages. My hand ached, but my heart felt freer. It wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. About putting into words the life of a man the world had ignored. I didn't plan for anyone to read it. I just wanted my story to exist somewhere, even if it was only on paper. That night, for the first time in a long time, I slept peacefully. The pain was still there, but it had changed shape. It wasn't crushing me anymore. It was building something inside me. I didn't know then that this small act, this simple notebook, would change my life forever. But that was the moment everything began. The moment I stopped being a victim of my son's cruelty and started becoming something else. Something stronger. The journal became my only friend. Every night when the house was quiet and everyone was asleep, I would sit by the window with a small candle and that old notebook. The light flickered weakly, but it was enough to see the page. I didn't write like a man chasing a dream. I wrote like someone trying to survive. The words came out raw, heavy, sometimes shaking with anger, sometimes with tears. Each line carried a piece of my pain, a memory I couldn't say out loud. I wrote about my childhood, about how I started working at 13, about the hunger I knew even before I had a family of my own. I wrote about the first day I held my son in my arms, the joy I felt, and how I promised myself I'd never let him go hungry. And then I wrote about how, in the end, that same child told me not to beg. At first, it hurt to relive everything. Some nights I had to stop because my hands were trembling too much. Other nights, I cried so hard the ink smeared across the page. But I kept going, because the more I wrote, the more I began to understand myself again. I had spent so long trying to be a good father that I had forgotten I was still a man who felt, who hurt, who mattered. I started keeping a routine. I would wake up early, do the small chores around the house, and when everyone left, I would take the notebook out and read what I had written the night before. Then, I'd add more. Sometimes I wrote about little things, the smell of my wife's cooking back when she was alive, the sound of my son's laughter when he was a boy, the pride I felt when he got his first job. And then I wrote about how that pride turned into silence, how the same laughter became cruel, how love turned into shame. It wasn't fancy writing. My grammar wasn't perfect. The spelling was wrong in places, but it was honest. Every word was mine. Every sentence came from a place of truth. It was like opening old wounds and cleaning them one by one. Painful, but necessary. One evening, I ran out of pages. The notebook was full. I sat there staring at the last line I had written. He laughed when I was hungry. I read that line over and over until my vision blurred with tears. That was the sentence that started everything, and the one that would never leave me. The next day, I walked to the local library. It was the only place I went to feel peace. The librarian, a kind woman in her 50s, noticed the notebook in my hand and asked what it was. I hesitated, then gave it to her. Just something I've been writing, I said. She smiled and promised to take a look. I didn't think much of it. I didn't expect anything. A week later, she found me sitting outside on the bench and said she had read it all. Her eyes were red. She said my story broke her heart. She said people needed to hear it, that there were thousands of fathers like me who felt invisible. I didn't know what to say. She asked if I'd let her type it out, fix the spelling, and try to publish it. I was embarrassed at first. I told her it wasn't worth anyone's time, but she insisted. It's not just words, she said. It's truth. That night, I went home thinking about what she said. Maybe she was right. Maybe my story wasn't just my pain. Maybe it was something bigger, something that could make people think before they laughed at someone weaker. So I agreed. She spent the next few weeks typing every page, word for word. She didn't change my tone, just cleaned it up. And then one day, she handed me a printed copy. A book with a title she had chosen. A Father's Journal. My name was on the cover. My story, my pain, my life. All inside those pages. I held it in my hands, and for the first time in years, I smiled. Not because I thought it would make me famous, but because I finally felt seen again. When she handed me that printed copy, my hands trembled. I had never seen my name on anything before. All my life I'd signed bills, receipts, payslips, but this was different. This was mine, my story, my pain, my truth. I couldn't believe it. I took it home carefully, like it was something fragile. That night, I sat at the table, turned the pages slowly, and read my own life like it belonged to someone else. I could still hear his laughter between the lines, but for the first time, it didn't hurt as much. It felt lighter, like the pain had somewhere else to live now, inside those pages instead of inside me. A few days later, the librarian called. She said she had shown my story to a small local publisher. They wanted to print a few hundred copies. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't an author. I was just an old man who had written down his pain. I told her I had no money to pay for anything, but she said I didn't need to. They'll cover the costs, she said. They believe in it. I hung up the phone and sat there in silence, unsure if I should be happy or scared. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking, what if people laughed? What if they said it was pathetic? What if my son saw it and mocked me again? But then another thought came. What if someone out there read it and understood? What if some other father, sitting in silence like I once did, found comfort in my words? That idea gave me courage. I decided to say yes. The publisher called me in the next week. I walked to their office in my old shirt and worn shoes, feeling completely out of place. But they welcomed me like I mattered. They treated me with respect, something I hadn't felt in years. They showed me the cover design. It was simple, white with bold black letters. A Father's Journal, the story of pain and forgiveness. I stared at it for a long time, unable to speak. Then, with a shaky voice, I said, "Print it." It took a few weeks for the first copies to be ready. The librarian called again when they arrived. When I walked in and saw them stacked neatly on the counter, my heart felt strange, heavy and full at the same time. She smiled and said, "You did this." I wanted to tell her no, that pain did this, that loneliness did this, but I just nodded. I picked up one copy and held it to my chest. It was the first time I'd ever felt proud of myself without needing anyone else's approval. When the books started to appear on shelves, I didn't think much of it. I assumed no one would notice. But then something unexpected happened. People started reading it. People started talking about it. The librarian called again and said they had run out of copies in less than a week. The publisher called too. They needed to print more. Letters began arriving from strangers who said my words made them cry, who said they saw their own fathers in my story. Some said it changed the way they treated their parents. I read each letter slowly, tears filling my eyes. All those years of silence, all those nights of humiliation, they had turned into something powerful. That was when I made the decision. I wasn't going to hide anymore. I wasn't going to let shame silence me. For years I begged for food, for love, for respect. Now, people wanted to hear me. So when the publisher asked if I'd attend a small book event to talk about my story, I said yes. My voice might have been small, but my story wasn't. I owed it to every father who had been forgotten, every old man who sat alone wondering if his life meant anything. I didn't know that saying yes would change everything, that it would take me from being the man who begged at his son's table to the man whose words would make people stand in line. But that was the moment. The moment I chose not to be a victim anymore, but a voice. The day my book was released publicly, I didn't expect anything. I didn't tell anyone about it, not even my son. I thought maybe a few people would read it, maybe a few would forget it. But life has a strange way of turning quiet stories into storms. Within days, something started to happen. Messages, letters, even strangers coming to the small library asking to meet me. The librarian called me again and said, "Your story is spreading, sir." People are crying when they read it. I didn't know what to say. I just sat there, clutching the old phone in disbelief. For so long, my words meant nothing to anyone. And now, people were listening. A local journalist came to see me. He said he'd read the book and wanted to write an article about me. The father whose pain became a lesson. I didn't think much of it, but he insisted. He took a photo of me holding the book, sitting at the same kitchen table where my humiliation had once begun. The article came out 2 days later. It spread faster than I could ever imagine. Within a week, national papers were printing my story. They called me the father who forgave, though they didn't know the truth. I hadn't forgiven anyone yet. I had only learned how to survive without hate. Soon, the publisher called and said, "We need you to come to the city. Your book is selling everywhere." I hesitated at first. I didn't want attention. I was just a tired old man who had turned pain into words. But something inside me said to go, not for fame, but for meaning. So, I went. They brought me to a small TV studio where they interviewed me about my life. I told the truth, about hunger, about loneliness, about what it feels like when your own blood turns cold toward you. I spoke slowly, simply, honestly. I didn't need fancy words. Pain speaks for itself. After the interview aired, everything changed. People from all over began sending messages. Young men apologizing to their fathers, daughters writing about their mothers, families saying they sat together and cried after watching it. My book sold faster than the publisher could print it. They called me a best-selling author. I didn't even know what that meant at first. I didn't care. All I knew was that my voice, the voice no one wanted to hear, now echoed in thousands of homes. The same week, the city mayor invited me to speak at a charity event about family and forgiveness. I stood on that stage, my hands trembling, staring at a crowd of hundreds. They clapped when I walked in, but I didn't feel proud. I felt humbled. I spoke about what it means to grow old in a world that forgets you. I told them how it feels to be hungry in your own house, to be invisible at your own table. And when I finished, people stood and clapped. Some cried. Others just nodded quietly. It wasn't applause for me. It was for every father who had suffered in silence. That night, I went home to a hotel room they had booked for me. It was small but clean, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw a man I barely recognized. Not because I looked different, but because I finally saw value in the reflection. For years, I thought my life was over the moment my son turned away from me. But now, I realized that pain can be a beginning too. A week later, my publisher called with news that made my hands shake again. My book was being translated into 3 languages. "You've become an international author," he said. I laughed softly. A few months earlier, I was the man who begged for food. Now people wanted my words in their homes. Life truly has its own justice, quiet, slow, but sure. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not revenge, not pride, just peace. I didn't need to prove myself to anyone anymore. My story had done that for me. But the biggest moment was still ahead. The day I would see my son again. The day he would stand in front of me, not as my child, but as a stranger waiting in line. It was 2 days after my first television interview that everything came full circle. The publisher had arranged a public book signing in town. A simple event, nothing grand, just me sitting at a small table in the community hall with piles of books beside me. I didn't expect many people to come. I thought maybe a few readers would stop by, say hello, and leave. But when I arrived, my heart stopped. The line stretched outside the building. Dozens of people, young and old, holding copies of my book, waiting for a moment of my time. Some had tears in their eyes. Some just smiled. They weren't looking at me with pity. They were looking with respect. It was a feeling I had forgotten existed. As I sat down at the table, I tried to steady my hands. People began coming up one by one. A woman hugged me and said my book made her call her father again. A young man said it made him apologize to his mother. Every story they told felt like a stitch closing the wound that had lived inside me for years. I listened, smiled, thanked them, signed each book carefully. I didn't feel like an author. I felt like a man finally seen after a lifetime in the shadows. Then, in the middle of all those faces, I saw someone I never thought I'd see again. My son. He was standing at the back of the line, holding a copy of my book in his hands. For a second, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I blinked, but he was still there, older, thinner, his once proud expression replaced with something I couldn't name. Maybe shame, maybe disbelief, maybe both. He looked unsure, shifting from one foot to the other, watching me from a distance. The people in line kept moving, and so did I. My pen didn't stop, but my heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I didn't know if I was ready for this, for him. After all the years, all the silence, all the things unsaid, what could we even say now? But before I could think more, it was his turn. When he stepped forward, everything went quiet around me. He looked down at the table, unable to meet my eyes. His hands trembled slightly as he placed the book in front of me. The same hands that once pointed toward the door and told me to get out. I looked at them, then at his face. There were tears at the corner of his eyes. His lips moved like he wanted to say something, but no words came out. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Dad, could you sign this for me?" For a moment I couldn't move. The memories came flooding back. That night at the kitchen table, the laughter, the hunger, the humiliation. But instead of anger, all I felt was an empty calm. I picked up the pen, opened the book, and began to write. I didn't write my full name. I didn't write anything grand. I just wrote 3 words that came from the deepest place in my soul. God remembers everything. Then I closed the book and slid it back to him. He took it with shaking hands, his eyes wide, his face pale. I didn't look at him again. I just moved to the next person in line and smiled, as if nothing had happened. But inside, I could feel something breaking. Not in pain this time, but in release. Years of silence, of longing, of unspoken hurt, all ending in one small, simple moment. As he walked away slowly, I saw his shoulders tremble. I don't know if he cried. I didn't need to know. The man who once laughed at my hunger now stood in line with strangers to ask for my name on a page. Life had turned the table, quietly, perfectly, without a single word of revenge from me. And for the first time, I didn't feel small anymore. I didn't feel powerless. I was no longer the father who begged. I was the man whose story made people feel. My hunger had turned into purpose. My pain had become proof that dignity always finds its way home. He stood there for a long time after I signed his book. He didn't move. He just held it tightly against his chest like it was something fragile, something sacred. I didn't look up again, but I could feel his presence, the same way you can feel rain in the air before it falls. People around us kept talking, smiling, asking for autographs. But in that moment, all I could hear was silence. It was the kind of silence that carries a lifetime inside it. The kind that only a father and son can share after years of hurt. He finally stepped aside, but he didn't leave. I saw him standing near the door, watching me sign for others. His eyes were red, his face pale. Every few minutes, he wiped his face with the back of his hand. I knew he was crying, but I didn't go to him. Not because I didn't care, but because I had already spent years running after him. Years trying to fix a relationship he was never ready to hold. This time, if there was to be peace, he would have to walk toward it himself. When the event ended, I thanked everyone who came, smiled for a few photos, and started gathering my things. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, hesitant. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. He stood there for a few seconds, not saying anything. Then, in a shaky voice, he whispered, "I'm sorry." The words hung in the air like a ghost. I froze. For years, I had imagined that apology. I had pictured it 1,000 times, how it would sound, how I would react, what I would say. But standing there, I realized something. I didn't need it anymore. Forgiveness doesn't always come with words. Sometimes it comes when you stop needing someone to understand your pain. I turned around slowly, met his eyes, and saw the boy I once knew. Not the man who mocked me, but the scared child I raised. He looked smaller now, older in a way that had nothing to do with age. Life had caught up to him. I could see the weight of guilt sitting on his shoulders. He tried to speak again, but his voice broke. I just nodded, gently, quietly. I didn't need to say, "I forgive you." He already knew. Some things don't need sound, they just need time. He stepped closer, still holding the book. "You wrote, 'God remembers everything,'" he said softly. His eyes filled again. "Do you really believe that?" I took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes," I said, because he saw everything. The hunger, the laughter, the silence, the pain. And he gave me this moment. He covered his face and began to cry. Right there, in that crowded hall, in front of strangers and cameras, my son, the same one who once laughed while I begged for food, broke down like a child. I didn't rush to comfort him. I didn't hold him. I just watched, letting him feel the weight of everything he had done. Pain had taught me that some lessons only sink in through silence. After a while, he took a step back and whispered, "I'm proud of you." Those words, simple as they were, hit harder than all the insults he'd ever thrown at me. Maybe because they came too late. Maybe because I had already stopped needing them. I just smiled faintly and said, "Take care of yourself." That was the last thing I said to him that day. He nodded, still crying, then turned and walked away slowly. I watched him disappear into the crowd, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt free. The circle was complete. The boy who once denied me food had now stood in line for my name. The same hands that threw me out of his life now held my story like a treasure. I packed my pen and closed the book. My heart was quiet, not happy, not bitter, just still. I had carried pain for so long that I had forgotten what peace felt like. But that day, I found it again. Not through revenge, not through pride, but through truth. Life had written its own ending, not with anger, but with justice. And I finally understood. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is not to fight, but to outlive the pain and let the world see who you become after it. When I walked out of that hall, the sun was setting, and the air felt different. I stood for a while on the sidewalk, watching people leave, holding my book, smiling, taking pictures. I could still see my son in the distance, standing near the road, clutching his signed copy tightly. He wasn't the proud man I once knew, the one who laughed when I was hungry, the one who thought he was too important to care. Now he looked lost, small, and hollow. For a moment, I almost wanted to walk up to him, to tell him everything would be okay. But I didn't, because I realized that life had already given him the lesson I never could. That was the reversal. Not that I became famous or rich or respected. The real reversal was how life flipped the meaning of everything. I used to beg for food from the same son who was now starving for forgiveness. I used to be invisible in my own home, and now strangers lined up for my words. I used to think I was the weakest man alive, but now I understood that surviving humiliation with silence takes more strength than pride ever could. He once thought success made him powerful, but he was wrong. Power isn't what you hold, it's what you endure. In the weeks after the book signing, my story spread even further. I was invited to speak at schools, old age homes, even television programs. Each time, I spoke about what it means to love someone who forgets your worth. People cried. Some stood up to clap. But what stayed with me most were the quiet moments afterward. When someone would walk up, hold my hand, and whisper, "Your story is mine too." That was when I realized it was never really about revenge. It was about showing that pain can be turned into purpose, even when no one believes in you. Then one day, I got a message from my son. It was short, just a few lines. He said he'd quit his job, that he couldn't walk through the city without people recognizing him as the man from the book. He said people looked at him differently now, not with respect, but with pity. He said he deserved it. I didn't reply. Not because I hated him, but because I finally understood that his suffering wasn't my responsibility anymore. For years, I carried the guilt of being useless. Now he carried the weight of those words instead. Life had finally balanced the scales. A few weeks later, he showed up at one of my book events again. This time, he didn't bring a book. He just stood at the back, listening. When I finished speaking, he came up to me quietly and said, "I don't want anything, Dad. I just wanted to listen." I nodded. There was nothing more to say. I think that's when he truly realized what respect means. Not fame, not money, but standing silently in the presence of the person you once broke. After that, I didn't see him much. I didn't need to. I knew life would continue teaching him, the way it taught me. And as for me, I finally had peace. I lived simply, no luxury, no servants, just my pen, my notebook, and a small apartment filled with books. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, thinking about those cold nights on the bench when I was hungry and forgotten. But instead of pain, I felt gratitude. Because without those nights, I would never have written a single word. The world now called me inspiring, but I knew the truth. I was just an old man who refused to let cruelty destroy him. That was my victory. My revenge wasn't in hurting anyone. It was in becoming someone no one could ignore. And the greatest irony of it all? The same son who once called me weak had now become my reader. He might never say it out loud, but I know. Every time he opens that book, he sees himself on those pages. He sees the pain he caused, the love he threw away, and the father who rose from the dust. That's what true reversal looks like. Not a loud ending, but a quiet justice, when the one who broke you is forced to learn from the pieces. Justice didn't come like thunder. It came slowly, quietly, the way dawn replaces darkness, soft, steady, unstoppable. I didn't wake up one day feeling victorious or proud. I just started noticing the silence inside me. The anger was gone. The shame was gone. All that remained was peace, the kind that comes when you stop waiting for people to value you and start valuing yourself. For years, I thought justice meant watching my son suffer the way I did. But true justice wasn't about revenge. It was about knowing that I survived everything meant to destroy me, and became something greater because of it. People asked me if I ever forgave my son. I never gave them a simple answer, because forgiveness isn't a moment. It's a process. There were nights when I'd lie awake remembering his laughter when I begged for food. It still hurt. There were days when I'd see families walking together and wonder what it would feel like to be loved again. But then I'd walk into a bookstore, see my book on the shelf, and remember that I turned pain into something people could learn from. I forgave him, not because he deserved it, but because I deserved peace. My son tried to come back into my life again later. He sent letters, messages, even visited my building once. He said he wanted to make things right. But by then, I had learned a truth most people never understand. You can't rebuild a house that was burned by pride. You can forgive, but you can't pretend the fire never happened. So, I kept my distance. I didn't hate him. I simply no longer needed him to define my worth. That was the justice I never saw coming. Years passed, and my book became something bigger than I could have imagined. Schools used it to teach lessons about empathy. Old age homes kept copies for residents who felt forgotten. People from around the world sent me letters calling me a father figure they never had. I would sit alone in my small room, reading those words with tears in my eyes, realizing that the son who rejected me made me a father to millions. Life has a strange sense of irony. It takes away one thing only to give you something greater in return. One day, I got a package in the mail. It was from my son. Inside was his own book, a small one, with a handwritten dedication on the first page. To my father, the man I broke, and the man who taught me what strength really means. I didn't cry when I read it. I just closed the cover and whispered, "It's enough." Because that was the final piece. That was the circle closing. He had finally learned. Now, when I look back at everything, the hunger, the humiliation, the laughter, the pain, I don't see tragedy anymore. I see purpose. Every cruel word, every sleepless night, every empty plate, they built me. They carved something unbreakable inside me. I used to think being a father meant protecting your child from pain. But now I know. Sometimes being a father means letting them fall and standing strong enough for them to see what they lost. The world called me successful because of my book. But success wasn't the money or the fame. Success was sitting in silence and knowing I no longer needed anyone's approval to feel alive. Success was realizing that I had become everything they said I couldn't be. And the greatest success of all was that I didn't lose my heart in the process. So, when people ask me what justice looks like, I tell them this. Justice is when the person who laughed at your hunger ends up learning from your strength. Justice is when you no longer carry bitterness, only wisdom. Justice is when life lets you rise so high that even your pain becomes your greatest teacher. And now, whenever I see a father sitting alone, looking tired, defeated, I tell him, don't give up. Because one day, the same people who laughed at your struggle might stand in line for your story. Life always remembers. God always remembers. And justice, true justice, never forgets its way home.